Muito boa tarde a todos.
Já está, neste momento.
Já? Obrigada. Muito boa tarde. Vamos então dar início a mais um seminário integrado no ciclo de seminários do Mestrado em Investigação Clínica da Faculdade de Medicina de Lisboa. E hoje é a nossa convidada, a doutora Gaia Kiru, da Imperial College London, que irá falar sobre o tema Gestão de um Estudo Multicêntrico. Irei então passar para inglês, uma vez que a nossa convidada é estrangeira e, portanto, para melhor nos entendermos todos. Hello, Gaia. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, even if it's virtual. Professor Gaia, she's the Head of Operations and Partnerships Management at ICTU Global, which is an academic research organization at Imperial Clinical Trials Unit at Imperial College London. And she is responsible for the operational and strategic activities to run trials and studies in collaboration with healthcare, academia, pharmaceutical, and also biotech partners. Gaia, she has over 16 years of experience in delivering national and international clinical research with projects not only with the NHS, but also with academia. I have met Gaia more than 15 years ago in London while I was doing my PhD, and we worked together in a project that was the start of my passion for clinical research. I am sure that we will have a great seminar today, and in the end we have room for some questions that you may ask. And I will pass now the word to Gaia. Thank you, Gaia. It's really good to welcome you here. Agora apenas em português, para os alunos de mestrado que estão a assistir via Zoom, poderão colocar as dúvidas no final, algum comentário na própria plataforma. Para quem está no YouTube, do lado direito, tem então a oportunidade para colocar alguma questão que no final podemos discutir. Gaia, you can start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you for inviting me to speak this afternoon. It's a pleasure, as always, to present for you. I think the last time was in person in 2018. So it was all those years ago already. And at the time, I'm going to present a study to you and how we managed that study. And at the time, when I last saw you for your master's course in 2018, we were just finishing the study. So now I can recap on what we did and how we executed that study in the end. But thank you for the very kind introduction as well. So just to reiterate, so I work in the arm of ICTU Global. It's a part of the Imperial Clinical Trials Unit, and we work in collaboration with industry sponsors and funders to deliver clinical trials and studies. And so I've worked in this team for since 2017. And it was soon after I joined the team that we ran the study that I'm about to present to you. It was quite a complex study, a big study, and I think that's why it is quite, hopefully you'll find it quite interesting and all the obstacles and things that we faced. But I think, as Ines said, there'll be some time for some questions at the end, so please feel free to let me know if there's anything more you'd like to know. So I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay, great. So yes, I'll be presenting a study called Da Vinci, which was sponsored and funded by Amgen. I think the last time I gave this talk, because we were in the middle of the study, I wasn't able to disclose who we worked with, but now this study has been published. It was published last year in the European Journal of Preventative Cardiovascular Medicine. So I can give you all the detail. Right. As I said, ICTU Global is an academic research organisation based in Imperial College. We collaborate with industry partners and really provide, like our colleagues over in Lisbon, we provide scientific leadership and full service delivery of clinical trials. So right from the beginning, trial design, all the way through to undertaking all the operational aspects required, all the way up to publication. And why do we do this? What do we want to do? it's really sort of global recognition of our expertise, publication in world-leading journals, and influencing clinical practice. Of course, as an academic organisation, we approach studies and trials with a real interest for knowledge and progression in science and in clinical practice. And more recently, we've been focusing on implementation research and implementation barriers. So you hear a lot about clinical trials, finding new drugs, finding new doses, new treatments, and so on. But there's a gap between finding those treatments and getting them into clinical practice. How do we, once we have a good drug, a drug that we know that works, how do we make sure that it gets to the patients who need it? And that's what we're calling implementation research. And across the UK, where I am, I'm in London, and across the world, implementation research is becoming, much more popular and an area of increased interest as we try to fill those gaps. This is the structure of our unit. I won't go through it in detail, but there's about 80 people in our department, our directors, and then we have different teams, clinical data systems, statistics, and 2 operational groups. One who run the academic, what we call the academic studies. They're funded by research grants, charities, and so on. And then in dark blue there in the bottom right-hand corner is ICTU Global. That's the team that I lead. The team that works with industry partners. As I said, we undertake all activities required to set up, manage, deliver clinical trials and studies across various therapeutic areas. The directors of our department, Professor Neil Poulter and Professor Kaushik Ray, they have a cardiovascular interest, and so our portfolio tends to be quite cardiovascular heavy. But across the unit, we're also interested in all sorts of other therapeutic areas, and some of the key ones are just shown for you there. So as Ines said, I've been working at Imperial for nearly 16 years, and before that, I spent some time in the NHS and a very small amount of time as well working for a pharmaceutical company doing data management. And there's probably 5 or so factors that I think are important when it comes to operational success of a study or a trial. For me, the number one is the team. The team are the people that will undertake all the activities required. So making sure you have the right people, making sure they're appropriately qualified and trained. If you're doing the masters in clinical research, then you'll be well aware of GCP and how important education experience is when it comes to delivering research. Communication, these projects are often very complicated and communication is key. There might be multiple people, all with some with the same skills and same tasks, but other people, there might be legal teams, statistics teams who have different interests, and it's really making sure that the communication flows effectively. Planning, of course, it sounds obvious, but something maybe that's sometimes missed is the a sufficient amount of planning that's needed to deliver something that's quite operationally complex. Risk management, identifying the right risks and the correct risks, and really trying to avoid those risks, putting things in place to make sure that anything that untoward is avoided. Of course, strong project closure. And what I mean by that is making sure you have a target in mind, a date by which you want to complete the project. Of course, anytime a project is extended or is late in terms of delivery, it's a huge cost implication. So making sure you've always got that target in mind, and you're making sure you're, again, planning, making sure you can close the project on time. With that all in mind, I'll be presenting to you how we managed and ran a study called Da Vinci, which, as I said, was sponsored and funded by Amgen. We started it in 2017, and it was an international multi-center, non-interventional clinical study. What we wanted to do was to create a registry, and again, this comes back to the implementation research piece, which I explained. So what we want to do is create a registry of 1 year retrospective data across a cross-sectional cohort of PP, that's primary prevention, CHD, coronary heart disease, PVD, peripheral vascular disease, and stroke patients. So collect a registry of these patients and data from these patients in order to estimate the proportion of patients in Europe with a LDL-C above 2016 ESC guidelines. So low density lipoproteins, so cholesterol, looking at patients who've got a proportion above the recommended European guidelines. I'm going to go straight to the results before I go into the operations. So we found that amongst patients receiving LLT, that's lipid lowering therapy, so amongst those receiving lipid lowering therapy, fewer than half of the high and very high risk primary and secondary prevention patients were achieving the goals required for the 2016 goals, and only a fifth were achieving the lower 2019 goals. So that really shows the gap. So we've got these treatments for lowering cholesterol, but there's clearly patients there who are high risk or very high risk who aren't achieving those goals, and it would be very beneficial to those patients if their lipids could be lowered, the LDL-C could be lowered from a health perspective. So it took part across 18 countries in Europe, 150 sites, 600 research staff were involved, and 6,000 patients was our target. And we ran this solely from London. We didn't have teams who were based out in all of the other countries. In our scope was to identify the participating sites, as I said, over 150 of them, sign CDAs, conduct feasibility, select the sites for participation, undertake all the ethical approvals, local approvals required across all of the countries, undertake all the contracts, financial management, training the sites, providing sites with all the documents they required, investigator site files, for example, tracking and monitoring recruitment, undertaking all the monitoring activities, and closing out the sites, and of course the trial master file management as well. These are the countries that took part. You can see it was quite broad. As I said, it was 18 countries. I hate giving this talk if Portugal wasn't involved. I did suggest that Portugal should be involved. Unfortunately, a decision was made not to include Portugal. But you can see quite broad scope across Europe. 6,000 patients was our target, and we needed to have 50% of those, so 3,000 patients that were primary prevention, i.e. they haven't had a cardiovascular event yet. Another 3,000 patients secondary prevention, patients who'd already had an event, and they were further broken down into CHD, stroke, and PVD patients. So even amongst just the 6,000, recruit 6,000 patients, we had to be quite careful about the type of patients that we were recruiting and the number that we were recruiting in each category. Make things a little bit more complicated, the sponsor also wanted a geographical spread across each country. So they didn't want us to go just to the main cities in each of these 18 countries, but they wanted us to have rural, urban areas as well. So again, another consideration when planning the trial. So the target number was 162. The feasibility process commenced in January 2017. And then we started the process of contacting and identifying sites, sending out the CDAs, undertaking feasibility and doing calls to see whether they could and they should come on board. The table there you see at the bottom is the number of sites that we had to approach at each stage. And you can see to get the 162 sites, which was our target, in the end, a fewer number than that opened. We had to contact 540 sites. We were contacting sites across all these different countries. Sites were declining for one reason or another, or they didn't have capacity, for example. Some didn't respond. And so we had to contact a huge number of sites. I mean, in the end, now we have this great database of sites across Europe, which is fantastic. But at the time, it was more work than we anticipated. And then you can see there the number of CDAs returned, number of feasibility questionnaires returned, and the number of calls and so on that we scheduled. So it was a very intensive process. I think at the time, in total across our team, there was about 15 members of staff working on just this project alone, and we had specific staff who were dedicated to specific countries. Information from that table is just tabulated here, but it's just sorry, in a graphical form here, but it's just to show you really how long this process took. So from January, you can see once we'd hit sort of 540 sites approach, that was nearly 7 months of work. And again, just showing the disparity there in the number of sites we contacted versus the number of sites who actually took part. And it will vary from site to study to trial as to how many sites you need to contact for this sort of study. Maybe if it was an IMP trial, a CTIMP, which was interventional, maybe there could have been more interest. I think some sites felt actually, you know, come back and speak to us if it's interventional. We're not so interested in this sort of registry exercise. But in the end, you know, it's been a very important study to undertake. So approvals, ethics approvals. There was large variations in the process and requirements across Europe, as you can imagine. And I just wanted to list these here just for your awareness, so you can see how different it can be across countries, and also on the next slide how different the timelines can be for ethics approvals as well. So some countries had countrywide ethics committees, like in the UK, we have a single ethics committee approval for the entire country. Some had regional ethics committees. In Spain, if I remember correctly, the different regions had their own ethics committees. Some, I think it was Italy, some had site-by-site ethics committees. So every site you went to, their own ethics committee had to review the project. Very, very variable response times. In the UK, we have a fixed timeline of up to 60 days for certain things, 35 days for amendments and so on. But these timelines really varied across countries. Everyone loves a summer holiday, but it really did impact our study if they'd say, sorry, July and August, there's no ethics committee meetings, because that would, you know, that would delay the study by a couple of months, and a couple of months can be a long time when you're trying to push things forward. Of course, there were different document requirements for each committee as well. So for the 152 sites in the end, applications had to be made to over 70 ethics committees. So again, from the UK, where we thought, okay, you know, it might be, we'd done some homework, but we didn't quite expect it was going to be quite as many as 70 ethics committees. So again, going back to the point of comprehensive planning and really understanding the landscape across Europe, this study from an operational point of view has been a huge learning curve for us. It shows the timelines across the various countries. You see the countries along the bottom from Poland through to Greece. And you see in the red the maximum number of weeks it took to get an ethics approval. In green, the minimum number of weeks. And sorry, in red is the maximum weeks, and the blue is the median. So this is ordered by median at the moment. So you can see it varied in the maximum number of weeks in red from maybe just a week. See in Poland through to Italy being 33 weeks, Austria being 33 weeks, and sometimes these are only certain specific sites. So the blue line really gives you an idea of sort of more the median, the average sort of timelines that we were looking at. But the variation was huge. So again, something to bear in mind when you're planning studies is this sort of thing. Site contracts, we knew that this was going to be a very big task, undertaking contracts across 18 countries. And so we did have dedicated staff members at the college to ensure we did and had quick review and try to reduce those delays. Again, there were a range of requirements across countries and across sites. So some you needed a contract with the institution, some you needed a contract with the principal investigator. Some sites needed a bipartite agreement, so it could just be Imperial and the site. Some needed tripartite, Imperial, the site, and the PI. And then some needed quadripartite, so that it could be Imperial, the site, the PI, and also another signatory at the institution from R&D, for example. Some needed wet ink signatures, so then we had contracts flying around Europe, with wet ink in envelopes, trying to get that on paper, scanned signatures. And I think since then we've moved forward a little bit more with e-signatures now, which is obviously so much easier. It's like DocuSign. Some sites had their own contract templates, which we weren't allowed to amend, and so that required additional review where possible. We tried to have a standard template across the entire study in all the countries, but some sites just pushed back on that and said it was mandatory to use their own templates. Then, of course, there was negotiations about fees as well, especially bearing in mind this was commercially funded. So, of course, 18 countries have discussed the different requirements that were needed across the different countries and sites. But I also want to talk about translations and overcoming that language barrier. So, of course, we were all based in London, all English speakers. I think we had a few members of the team who could speak second languages, but it wasn't particularly useful when it came to sort of legal terms and legal language. So we would end up with we'd start with a contract template. We would have our ICTU clinical research associate who would have that template, and they would be responsible for a specific country, say Spain, and they didn't speak Spanish, so they were responsible for Spain. They would send the contract to the translation company. The translation company would translate the contract into Spanish and send it back to our CRA. Our CRA would then send it to the research site for review in Spanish. The contract's now in Spanish, and the site would then send it back to our CRA in Spanish with their comments, their red lines in Spanish. So our CRA would send it back to the translation company, come back. So now we have the contract with changes in English. Would then go to our legal team, who would, depending on the changes, need to send it to the sponsor's legal mailbox. Again, depending on the changes, would send it to their country legal teams if required, before it came back to Imperial Legal. Imperial Legal will send it back to the CRA. It would go back to the translation company. And then that was our first round of review. For one contract, one round of review was these 14 steps, doing the translations in between. So obviously it was not the best way of, the most streamlined way of doing things. Before I joined the team, this was the model that was decided, this model of running everything from the UK. We had a translation budget, a big translation budget, so this was covered, but logistically it was complex. And I think it's up to you in future, when you are, if you are planning on working in the operational side of clinical trials and studies, is to think about, risks, time, budget, what works. If we hadn't done it this way, we would have had to have local teams in Spain, in all these other countries undertaking this work. That may have been more expensive. It probably would have been quicker, but more expensive. Lots of different contracting issues and getting them on board, taking new vendors on board and that sort of thing. But yeah, just highlighting that from a language perspective in terms of contracts, it was very tricky. Contracting timelines, again, a similar graph to before. We were looking up to 9 months in some countries for getting a contract sorted. Again, these are the worst case. The reds are the worst. You can see that some of the greens were great, 1 week, 3 weeks, 8 weeks, which is very reasonable and fine. But again, you can see which countries we were able to, if you look at the blue line, which countries were able to get things start going a little bit quicker and which countries took that little bit longer. And then finance and payments as well. So we found out that certain countries were not payable by our bank, particularly in Eastern Europe. There were a couple of currencies that were it was just not possible to pay in those currencies. We have quite strict anti-fraud procedures at the college, which meant that they had to do lots of checks on all of these sites to make sure that we could set them up as college suppliers. Again, that took some time. Some countries, payments were requested directly into the personal bank accounts of investigators, which for us in the UK anyway is very rare. We don't do that. We always have, unless it's a personal consultancy is different. But for a study like this, where you have a contract and you're undertaking work with an institution and patients from that institution, it's not something we would do in the UK, and so that sort of thing, which might be perfectly acceptable in another country, just took a little bit of time to sort of negotiate and approve through our finance teams. Use of Hotmail and Gmail accounts instead of institutional business accounts. This happens a lot. I still see sort of Hotmail and Gmail accounts being used. We always suggest that you deal directly with institutional bank accounts, and academic accounts, business accounts, rather than Hotmail and Gmail accounts, just from a security perspective. Finance departments of the sites unable to speak English, and therefore there was a bit of a barrier there in getting sort of confirmations and the communications. Part of our finance team's checks were to go onto the internet, do some due diligence and look up the organisation, do some research. And some hospitals, smaller GP practices as well, primary care sites, they just did not have pages. So all of these things together just meant that there were sometimes delays in making payments to sites. This is particularly was an issue in countries in Eastern Europe. So then training the sites, 150 sites, we didn't want to do 150 individual, I think in the end we opened 150, I think it was 132 sites that recruited in the end. We didn't want to do individual training sessions with each and every site. It would have been hugely time consuming. So what we did was we did countrywide site initiation visits in a central location. So our team would fly out to Spain, Czech Republic, Poland, hire a meeting room venue. All the investigators we paid for their flights, try and get them all into one room, and do a group training session there. If people couldn't attend, then of course we still did calls with them to train them. But this was great. It was nice to see everyone in person as well and really engage everybody. There was a significant cost and time saving. Disadvantages: sometimes people prefer to have that sort of smaller interaction. They don't like to ask too many questions when there's sort of 20-30 people in the room. But also, it did mean that sometimes staff could not attend. So we did end up doing quite a lot of remote SIVs as well, because maybe the PI could join, but the nurse couldn't join. We wanted to train the nurse. So we did do a lot of phone calls as well. But overall, this was a good way to proceed for this low risk study, because we didn't have to go to each individual hospital to check their pharmacy department or anything like that, because it was non-interventional. So that worked really well. In terms of monitoring, we did a risk assessment and the risk rating obviously came up as low. So monitoring was undertaken largely by phone. Part of our feasibility was to make sure there was a good standard of English, so we could speak to the sites and talk to them about recruitment and data queries and so on. So we did that every 4 to 6 weeks. And that was, as I said, it was remote. We had our first remote monitoring visit after the first patient was recruited. And then as a means of sort of doing some spot checks, 2 sites in each country had an on-site monitoring visit, and we had the criteria for these detailed in the monitoring plan. And the translators were booked to assist throughout these on-site monitoring visits as well. So we had a company that we worked with, and they had sort of medically qualified translators. So they would join us on site and help us look through the medical notes and so on and verify the data. And then we just did ongoing remote data cleaning. So only 36 sites in total had an on-site monitoring visit, and all of the rest had remote visits only. So that created a dilemma really of how to ensure data was accurate across the other sites. We were only visiting 2 in each country, so 36 on sites. What about all the other sites? And how do we make sure that the processes are correct? And how do we check consent forms and so on? So what we did, taking advice from some sort of experienced advisors, was to create these self-compliance checklists. So what we did was ask the sites to get an independent person at their side, so someone who hadn't taken consent or someone who wasn't dealing with that specific patient, and ask them the second person to check that the consent was okay, check the data, and check the site file. That we paid the sites a little bit, like a bit of a premium to undertake these activities for us, but they would sign off this checklist to say, I've checked that my colleague has undertaken consent accurately, I've checked the data against source, and so on. So it gave some responsibility to them. Largely they were happy with it because we told them that this is what we needed to do up front, and we said that this would be in place of us visiting them in person, and that was well received. And this was approved by the relevant teams, our team, our quality assurance team, and also the sponsors' compliance teams, as being acceptable for low-risk studies. And of course, with COVID and everything else that's happened in the past few years, a lot of remote activity has become essential. There's been no choice. So, this sort of thing. And then, of course, there's ways of undertaking remote checks as well. Data platforms and so on for data sharing have become much more common. So in terms of how we reported everything to the sponsor, we had weekly progress updates, which we would send them like at the end of the week. Fortnightly teleconferences, so a call with them every 2 weeks. We also send them a monthly status report, a more formal report of how we were progressing in each country. Also had day-to-day contact because sometimes our team had queries, they had something that needed approving by the sponsor, so we had like an operational contact at Amgen, we just dropped them an email, so ad hoc contact as needed. We also had some face-to-face meetings and so on at key points in the study. Being an academic unit, we don't necessarily have some of the very high-functioning, technologically advanced sort of CTMS systems and things. We're working on it. We'd like to get something in place. But just a note to say that even the more primitive tools like Excel can work really, really well for tracking. Sometimes, personally, maybe I'm getting old, I find it easier sometimes just to track things in a simple system like Excel, than using a CTMS system. We tracked everything, and tracking meant that we could see how long things were taking. Those graphs that I showed you before of how long contracts took, how long ethics approvals took, it's because we tracked all the dates, everything we were doing. So when we sent a CDA to a site, we would put the date in. When they responded, we would put a date in. When we were sending out feasibility questionnaires, everything was tracked in these Excel sheets, basically. And it just meant that we could really report well to the sponsor, give them lots of numbers, lots of metrics, and lots of reasons. If anything was delayed, we knew why, we knew how long it was delayed by. So from the feasibility process we were tracking the contracts, how long things were taking to sign, who had the contract. With it being such a big study, even one person could be looking after 20, 30, 35 sites. And it's a little bit difficult sometimes to keep all that information in your head, know exactly where everything is. The tracking takes a bit of time, of course, and you've got to build that into your workload, but we just found it a really useful exercise. And of course, we tracked all our calls that we had with the sites as well. And in these Excel sheets, we had a lot of rules. We had this Excel sheets calculating automatically dates, timelines, highlighting in red if things were, automatically highlighting in red if things were falling outside of timelines and that sort of thing. So Excel can be quite clever, I think, if you sort of know how to use it. And I'm still learning about some of its functionality. I think Ines definitely seen this picture before. Site engagement is always a hot topic because when you contact these sites, they're very keen and they want to be selected. The ones who want to participate want to be selected. You initiate them, but sometimes when it comes to, you've opened them and you want them to recruit, sometimes things can slow down, and there's always clinical pressures and other studies, staff resource issues, and so on. So active recruitment is a phase where we try and really, really keep close contact with our sites, make sure that the study that you're working on is of high priority for them. They don't lose their enthusiasm. We were sending out newsletters, having conferences, and so on with them to try and keep that engagement. So this shows where we ended up with recruitment. So you can see from June 2017 all the way to November 2018 when we finished recruitment. And you can see it's not consistent necessarily. And of course, bear in mind that from June 2017, that's when we opened our first sites. So as we're going through these months, more and more sites are opening. At the beginning, every site had a cap. So I think they had a cap of, maybe it was 20 patients or so. They had a cap of patients. And once they hit their target, they were asked to stop recruiting. And the reason is because the sponsor wanted this spread of recruitment across sites in the different countries. But what it meant is that some high recruiting sites who had lots of patients would stop at 20, whereas some sites who were struggling to recruit for one reason or another weren't able to really get up to that number. So in the end, I think it was around July 2018. So that's the fifth bar from the right. We decided to change the recruitment strategy and just open recruitment up. We needed to do that really to bring in patients. And you can see, so July and August, again, summer months. So recruitment slowed down a little bit. By September, that was 822 patients that were recruited in that month alone. And that's when we opened recruitment up and we said, everyone just recruit as many patients as you can. We spoke to our stats teams, the sponsor stats teams, and we said, look, how much of a difference is this geographical spread going to make to the results? And I think, again, sometimes when you think about your planning, when you're involved in trials in the future, there's things which are ideal. You know, if we were living in a perfect world, sure, that would be great if we can have this fantastic geographical spread. But in reality, sometimes and operationally, it's a little bit harder to execute. So I think it's about asking those questions early on as well. How important is this versus how operationally difficult this is, and also how much is this potentially going to extend timelines, and then of course the budget as well. But yeah, so we ended up recruiting in those last sort of 3-4 months, nearly 30% of the entire recruitment target. And that just shows how recruitment strategy is really important as well. A couple of points on this slide is just to say that at the end of this trial, this study, in total, we had a total of 20,000 data queries which were closed. You always expect data queries on your database, so the sites were collecting, these variables, age and the LDLC value and medical history, putting them into our database, which was a database called Inform, which you may or may have not heard of, just an electronic data capture system. And of course, sometimes there was missing data, or our CRAs would have a query on the data, and they'd raise these queries. Some of them would be automatic queries, as I said, if it was missing data or a data point was outside of range. So 20,000 data queries, which is a lot of queries. But what we did was, and coming back to my earlier point about strong project closure, we really did keep an eye on this. The sponsor was keeping an eye on this. We did not want to get to the end of recruitment and have 15,000 data queries to close. So we were really keeping a tight rein on data queries throughout the study, closing them as early as we can, cleaning data throughout the whole process. So, in summary, although the design of a study and trial is of course very, very important in terms of the science, the clinical validity, it's also making sure that the logistics can work and making sure that they're well thought through. I think sometimes what might work or what you might want to do from a clinical perspective or a scientific perspective isn't always easy to operationalize, or there's lots of planning and thinking that needs to be done to make sure that it's streamlined and straightforward. I'm sure you're learning about all of these things and as part of your course, but key points, these are key activities throughout a project lifecycle, are the feasibility and site selection, keeping an eye on on the timelines for approvals as well, recruitment rates, contracting times, finance, monitoring, staffing, and just overall management, how you project manage the project. Things like project management manuals and communication plans, all of that thinking that you do up front can really help streamline what you do later. involve all the potential departments and stakeholders early on. We really did try to think about that. You know, we're thinking about legal, how much work is it going to be for legal? So let's get new, you know, additional resource there. You know, finance, you know, it was a bit of a learning curve for us as well. Certain, you know, assumptions that we made, like, you know, that they'd be able to pay certain countries, certain currencies, there were assumptions which were incorrect. So again, a learning curve for us. As I said, a detailed project plan and planning meetings may help, and now we include this as standard in our budgets, because it's really building the foundation for how you're going to run your project. And I think sort of going too quickly without doing that foundation and planning work can mean you shoot yourself in the foot, because you end up thinking you do the thinking when it's sort of too late, and at that point it might just slow things down. So that's everything from me about how we ran Da Vinci. It was a fantastic project. We really enjoyed it. We had a great time. I think what I presented might sound a little bit overwhelming and stressful, but I'm yet to work on a project that doesn't have its challenges. There's always new things to learn. But it was a great project, and as I said, it was presented at ESC last year virtually, and it's now been published, and there's lots of secondary publications coming out of that. We're able to deep dive into the data of these 18 countries and look at, you know, not just the data and how lipids are managed across Europe, across the 18 countries, but also in each country we have really nice data where we can look at country specific issues. And I know that all the various principal investigators and national leads of the various countries are using that data to help think a little bit more about what needs to be done on a local basis. So that finished then, that's all wrapped up, all done, and we've got various other projects on our portfolio. As I said, they're all have different challenges. Some are interventional, they're clinical trials of medicinal product, others are observational, others have this sort of implementation spin on them, where we're really trying to see how we can increase sort of and change clinical practice to use medicines which are already available. But I hope that you found that interesting. It was, as I said, it was a great project and lots of learnings for us, and it was a pleasure to share them with you today.
Thank you very much, Gaia.
You're welcome. Thank you.
It is always very, very, very impressive, the management of this complex structure, and how you can conduct this study at a global level. When we see 70 ethics committee with different demands, it's really a challenge. I am glad that for us, an academic CRO, we may see similar challenges ahead, of course, in terms of the contracting, the finance, and also ethics procedures, because here in Portugal, when we have non-interventional studies, each site there have their own ethics, and of course they have different demands. Also, another curious thing is your countrywide SIV. We don't have that experience so far, so I think it's a great strategy. And as you said, it was overcoming, and for low budget, it was a really good idea. We have a few questions here from the audience. So, how COVID impacted clinical research activities, site management, and if this has changed the way you conduct research from someone from the YouTube Live.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think COVID has had a significant impact for us and globally as well. Of course, it's been a devastating thing to happen globally. But if you want to look at the silver lining in terms of research, it has really accelerated things. It's made us think differently about how we can, think about how we can do things differently. I was at a talk, a conference last year, and one of the GPs, one of the general practitioners, was saying that what COVID had done had accelerated technology advances, in a year, whereas if there wasn't COVID, it probably would have taken 10 or 20 years to get to that point. And what I'm referring to is really, you know, video conferencing, teleconferencing, all the things that we had to adapt to very quickly. That also made us think about, you know, what we do as operational staff, and do we need to be on site? What checks need to be done? What can we do remotely? You know, what's the risk? We had to stop, of course, all on-site activities. We were all at home, as you know, but there were still some trials that were running there in the background. So we really had to take a risk proportionate approach. Some patients, say on oncology trials, who were already in a trial, already receiving drug, we had to still see them, still try and undertake activities which were related to patient safety. We couldn't stop those because of patient safety, but everything else that was, you know, potentially optional that we were doing because it was a part of our procedures, it really made us think about it. And so a lot of our SOPs have changed, you know, especially in regards to monitoring, because there was traditionally you'd always go on site, and I think things would have changed before COVID, that you would do more remote activities like I showed you for this study, and we did do remote calls, the self-compliance checks, but we're really trying to absorb that more into what we're doing now. But it'll be interesting to see, because I think as of this week in the UK, our friend Boris Johnson he's announced his living with COVID plan, which means that all of our restrictions are going at the end, I think it's the end of this week. And so it'll be interesting to see what's mandatory, how things change, and how we continue to adapt. COVID's not going away. But I think in some ways that, you know, it has benefited a more progressive way of undertaking research.
Yes, we do agree. Of course, it had a huge impact for the negative side that we all know, but it happened to promote new ways of doing research. Of course, the risks they have to be balanced, but we agree as well that there are things that will stay, if not forever, for a long time, and that they are positive, and we have to see in that way. And taking your word when you said about the risk, we have another question from Susana Silva. What are the criteria for the risk rating? You have said that the study was a low risk study. What are the criteria for that? And in that I'm completing this question. If in the end you reassess and you check if your first assessment was correct, or if there was any change since the beginning until the end.
Sure. Yeah, another great question. So we have a risk assessment sort of SOP and working instruction that we follow at ICTU. So there's 3 risk levels: low, medium, and high. But we have quite a detailed table that we go through, and we look at different aspects of the study or trial that we're planning to conduct. So one section, for example, will be about patient safety. And so there's questions like, you know, is there an intervention? Yes or no. If there's no intervention, of course, immediately the risk is going down. If the intervention is, if it's a IMP, investigational medicinal product, is that IMP already licensed or is it not licensed? You know, what phase is the trial? So we look at the different, you know, interventions for the patients in terms of, you know, high risk procedures, for example. You know, is it a blood test, or is it them going under the general anesthetic or having surgery? You know, so we look at from a patient perspective. We also look at things from an operational perspective. Is it multi-country? What sort of data is being collected? How is the data being collected? Are there going to be third-party vendors, for example? So there's all the different aspects of the study. You build those in, and it gives you different numbers. There's basically different scores that you get. And at the end, this fancy sort of Excel thing will add up your scores, and then it will present whether they think it's high, medium, or low. And of course, so each team that's running a study will do that process in conjunction with our quality assurance team. So we're not blindly following the risk score. You know, it's a number that the system is spitting out, but we will look at it, think about it, and look at whether that's the right way to go or not. And if it's very low risk, it then takes you to a path where you need fewer visits on site. You need fewer monitoring visits overall. You don't need to do a SDV of all the patients. You don't need to check, every single document, for example. And if it's high risk, it will tell you to do more monitoring visits, more SDV. It might say to do 75% of patients SDV, the primary endpoints. Whereas if it's very low risk, you might only check 20% of patients for the primary endpoints. So, and of course you can adapt it. This gives you a guide of where you should go, and then you can have project and study specific discussions with the quality assurance team to decide where this lands and what your monitoring plan looks like. But when we did it for this study, because it was literally a data collection exercise, and it was pre-GDPR. So the patients were coming in for routine visits. They weren't even coming in for a study visit. It was a routine visit. They'd be consented, and their data from this one visit entered onto the system. So operationally, from a patient perspective, like the protocol, it was very, very simple and deemed to be low risk.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's perfect. It's really interesting the way you build that table that I guess it will have lots of criteria, and it's very important for the planning, as I said, to do it from the beginning and not to overdo things.
Yes, I'm sorry. The second part of your question I didn't answer. Do we review? Yeah, do we go back and look at it? We work with our QA teams throughout the study process. So anything that's gone wrong, protocol deviations, for example, protocol violations, we're feeding that into our QA team. So we have regular sort of update meetings for them. So if they felt that actually there are different risks here than we anticipated, or more risks here than we anticipated, we can then, of course, adapt our strategy, adapt our monitoring plan, and increase say on-site monitoring visits, for example. So it's a adaptive approach.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know if there are more questions. I don't think so. So we have a few minutes, but just one final question, Gaia. In your opinion, how the Brexit, of course, is a classic question, impact the conduction of clinical research, especially, of course, for external, out of the UK stakeholders? How was that impact on you?
Yeah, Brexit, it makes me very sad, and it still makes me and my colleagues very sad, because it's not something that a lot of people wanted. Obviously, we know how it went in the end, and there's still things happen, that make life more difficult for us. When we used to have free movement, obviously, didn't we, across Europe for students and visiting staff and so on, and it's become a lot more difficult in that regard. And I forget sometimes about Brexit, and we're no longer in the EU. We have people applying to do internships with us, to be visiting students with us. There's more paperwork is basically what's happened, more paperwork, and I think probably fewer opportunities in regards to research funding. There's EU programs for research funding, which the UK can no longer sort of access. There's also, really important EU-wide sort of research groups. And I think we'd contacted one of them last year, and we were told you're no longer a part of the EU, so this is no longer available to you. So yes, it has impacted us. Of course, we're still carrying on, but there's in terms of paperwork, it's just increased. And same with GDPR. GDPR, I know, which is affecting everybody, but it's impacted our paperwork a lot. And the fact that there was Brexit and GDPR has complicated things as well. We now have UK GDPR. We're not following EU GDPR. I mean, all the principles are the same, but again, the documents and the contracting process when it comes to transferring data outside of the UK, transferring data into the UK, is just that much more complicated because we're not in the EU, so it's not free flowing.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are closing. Thank you very much again for your participation with this great talk and sharing your experience. We hope to welcome you in Lisbon next time.
Yes, please.
And from the Faculty of Medicine and all the master students that are here with us today, and everyone from the live session, thank you for everyone, and have a good end of day.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.